She was found tied up in her own bedroom. Her husband was dead in the next room. Her mother was strangled just a few steps away. Nothing was stolen, no signs of a struggle. And somehow, she survived. But this wasn't the first time death followed her. 10 years earlier, she was alone in a private room with the President of France, and minutes later, he collapsed and died on his desk. No arrest, no conviction, just rumors whispered behind closed doors. Was she a victim? Or the most dangerous woman in Paris? Tonight, we're uncovering the true story of Marguerite Steinheil, a courtesan, a scandal, and a trail of bodies that history still refuses to explain. Stay with me, because the closer you look, the less innocent she appears. Paris was still half asleep when the door gave way. It was just after 5 a.m. on May 31st, 1908. The sky over the city had begun to pale, not with sunlight, but with that dull, gray hesitation that comes before day admits it is coming. Impasse Ronsin, a narrow, dead-end street tucked away from the grand boulevards, lay quiet, too quiet for a place that would soon belong to history. When the police forced their way into the Steinheil residence, they expected chaos. Instead, they found silence. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of extinguished candles and the faint trace of perfume, something floral, expensive, and out of place in a crime scene. Furniture stood where it should. No drawers were overturned. No cabinets hung open. The house did not look robbed. It looked paused, as if time itself had stopped in the middle of the night and forgotten to resume. Then they found her. Marguerite Steinheil lay on the bed in the master bedroom. Her wrists were bound behind her back with cord, tight enough to leave angry red marks on pale skin. A cloth gag pressed against her mouth, damp with breath. Her nightdress was wrinkled, her hair loose and tangled, framing a face that was neither bruised nor bloodied. She was alive, fully conscious, watching them. Her eyes moved first, sharp and alert, following the officers as they stepped closer. When they removed the gag, she did not scream. She did not sob. She drew in a deep breath, as if steadying herself for a performance she had rehearsed many times in her mind. "My husband," she said hoarsely. "My mother. They're dead." The words landed with a strange calm, devoid of hysteria, not cold, but controlled. One officer later said it felt less like a cry for help and more like a statement of fact. They found Adolphe Steinheil in the adjoining room. He lay on the floor near his desk, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His face had darkened, the tongue slightly protruding, the unmistakable marks of strangulation visible around his neck. There were no defensive wounds on his hands, no overturned furniture to suggest a violent struggle. Whatever had happened, it had ended quickly, or he had not been able to resist. Marguerite's mother, Émilie Japy, was discovered shortly after, in another room. She had been killed the same way. The similarity was impossible to ignore. 2 victims, same method, same house, same night. And 1 survivor. As the officers moved through the apartment, they noted what wasn't there. Jewelry remained untouched. Money lay where it had been left. No forced entry could be clearly identified. The doors and windows were intact, their locks unbroken. If intruders had come, they had done so with either remarkable skill or with permission. Marguerite was helped into a chair, a blanket draped around her shoulders, Only then did she begin to tremble, whether it was delayed shock or something more deliberate. No one could say. Between shallow breaths, she told her story. It had been late. She could not say how late. The house had been dark. Then, noise, shadows. 4 figures, she said, all dressed in black, their faces hidden. They had rushed her, tied her hands, gagged her mouth. She struggled, but there were too many of them. She heard sounds from the other rooms, muffled, terrible sounds, but could not see what was happening. And then silence. They left her there, bound and helpless. Until morning. The story was dramatic, detailed, almost too complete. The police listened without interruption, but doubt had already begun to creep in. Experienced men felt it instinctively, the way one feels a shift in the air before a storm. Something about the scene resisted easy explanation. Something about Marguerite Steinheil did not sit comfortably in the role of a passive victim. Most women, they thought, would be hysterical, broken, incoherent. Marguerite was composed. As word spread through the station and into the early editions of the morning papers, a name long buried in scandal resurfaced with explosive force. Reporters did not need to ask who she was. Paris remembered her. Nearly 10 years earlier, another man had died suddenly in a locked room. This one, far more powerful. Félix Faure, President of the French Republic, had collapsed in the privacy of his office at the Élysée Palace, moments after being alone with Marguerite Steinheil. She had walked away from that death untouched by law, though not by rumor. Now, once again, death had found her at close range. 2 bodies, 1 woman, no clear culprit, as the sun finally rose over Paris, casting pale light into the narrow street outside Impasse Ronsin. The unspoken questions settled heavily over the investigation. Was Marguerite Steinheil the unluckiest woman in France, or the common thread connecting tragedies that refused to be accidents? And this time, the city would not look away. Marguerite Steinheil repeated her account 3 times that morning, once to the officers at the scene, once again at the police station, and later, in quieter tones, to a magistrate who listened with narrowed eyes and a pen that never stopped moving. Each time, the story remained the same. 4 intruders, all men, all dressed in black, silent, efficient, precise. They had come in the night, she said, like shadows slipping between heartbeats. She had been awake, she was certain of that, but lying still, caught between sleep and thought. Then hands were on her, rough and practiced. A cord bit into her wrists. Fabric filled her mouth. She kicked. Once, but felt a sharp pressure against her ribs and understood resistance was pointless. They knew exactly what they were doing. She told them. This was not their first time. Her voice did not crack when she spoke. It did not rise. It moved evenly, as though she were describing something she had already accepted as inevitable. She said she heard her husband first. A muffled cry. A sudden thud. Then nothing. Later, how much later she could not say, came another sound. Her mother. A struggle this time. Brief, but unmistakable. Furniture scraping against the floor. Then silence again. Long. Absolute. Marguerite claimed she fainted. When she woke, the sky was lightening outside the window. The men were gone. She lay exactly as they had left her, bound, gagged, alive. It was a clean story. Too clean. The officers exchanged glances as she spoke, the kind that carried entire conversations without words. They had seen panic. They had seen shock. They had seen grief twist people into shapes barely recognizable as human. What they saw now was control. Marguerite answered every question promptly. She never asked what would happen next, never demanded justice, never once asked to see the bodies when they told her her husband and mother were dead. She closed her eyes, but only briefly. No tears came, just a slow breath, carefully measured, as if emotion were something to be rationed. One officer noticed her hands. The marks from the cord were real, angry, fresh, but they were neat, symmetrical. The knots, when examined, were simple, practical, not the kind tied by men in a hurry, but by someone with time. And then there was the house. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. The doors had been closed, not locked, but closed. Anyone entering would have needed either exceptional skill or familiarity with the home. "Did your husband have enemies?" one officer asked. Marguerite shook her head. "Did your mother?" Another pause, another calm denial. She did. However, offer one suggestion: a servant, a man who had once worked for them. She said, someone who knew the house, someone who might resent them, someone who might bring accomplices. The implication hovered in the air, delicate but deliberate. The officers noted it, but suspicion, once awakened, does not sleep easily. They returned to the bedroom. The bed showed no signs of struggle. The sheets were rumpled, but not torn. Marguerite's hair was disordered, but not as though someone had dragged her across the room, and though she claimed to have been overpowered by 4 men. There were no bruises on her arms, no marks on her legs, just the wrists. Outside, Paris was already talking. By noon, the newspapers had seized the story with hungry enthusiasm. The headlines were breathless, theatrical, unforgiving. Double murder in Paris. Wife found bound. Husband and mother dead. And then, inevitably, they printed her name, Marguerite Steinheil. The effect was immediate. Editors remembered. Readers remembered. Older men leaned back in cafe chairs and smiled knowingly. Younger reporters dug through archives with growing excitement. The past, it seemed, had been waiting patiently for its moment to return. They remembered another room, another body, another death that had never fully made sense. In 1899, when President Félix Faure had collapsed in the Élysée Palace, Marguerite Steinheil had walked out of history sideways, never charged, never officially accused, but forever linked to the moment a head of state died in her presence. Now, once again, she stood at the center of a mystery where everyone else was dead. The police felt it too, that faint, uncomfortable pressure that tells an investigator when a case is about to become something larger than evidence, larger than facts. This was no ordinary crime. This was a story Paris already wanted to tell, and whether Marguerite Steinheil was a victim of astonishing misfortune or the most composed liar in the city, one truth had already settled in. Her past was no longer background noise. It was motive. By the evening of May 31st, Paris no longer whispered. It spoke loudly, confidently, and with the certainty that only scandal provides. Cafes buzzed with speculation. Newspapers sold out before noon. In salons where art and politics once mingled politely, Marguerite Steinheil's name cut through conversation like a blade. People did not ask what had happened at Impasse Ronsin. They asked how long it had taken for something like this to happen again. Because, to Paris, this was not a new story. It was a return, nearly a decade earlier. In February of 1899, another man had died suddenly and inconveniently. And Marguerite Steinheil had been there too. Félix Faure, president of the French Republic, had collapsed inside his private office at the Élysée Palace, his body slumping forward over his desk while doctors rushed in too late to matter. Officially, it was an apoplectic seizure. Unofficially, everyone knew better, or thought they did. Marguerite had been alone with him. That single fact had never stopped echoing. At the time, the government had moved swiftly to bury any suggestion of impropriety. No woman was named in the first reports. The president had been ill. They said, his heart had been weak. Fate, not flesh, had claimed him. But Paris was not a city that accepted silence easily. Rumors spread faster than retractions. Within days, Marguerite Steinheil became a figure of dangerous fascination. Some called her a temptress, others a witch. A few, more cruel than clever, joked that she had loved a man to death. She was never charged, never questioned publicly. And yet, she paid a price no court could impose. From that moment on, Marguerite existed in a space between respectability and infamy, a demi-monde of her own making and her own confinement. Men sought her out precisely because of what surrounded her name. Women judged her from a safer distance. Doors opened, but never without consequence. Now, 10 years later, Paris saw a pattern. A president dead in a locked room, a husband and mother dead in a closed house, and in both cases, Marguerite Steinheil alive at the center. The police felt the weight of it almost immediately. Officially, she was a witness, a victim, a woman who had survived a brutal attack. But unofficially, every officer assigned to the case knew they were standing on ground already softened by suspicion. They began to look again, more carefully this time. They revisited the crime scene, slower now, less willing to accept what appeared obvious. They measured distances, timed movements, asked themselves uncomfortable questions. If Marguerite had been attacked first, how had the intruders subdued her without waking the rest of the household? If there were 4 men, why was there so little noise? If she had been bound for hours, why were there no signs of circulation damage beyond superficial marks? And perhaps most troubling of all, why had she been spared? In crimes of opportunity, witnesses are liabilities. In crimes of passion, they are often collateral. Yet Marguerite had been left alive, placed neatly on her bed, as though her survival were not an accident but a decision. When questioned about Félix Faure, she reacted with visible irritation for the first time. "That was years ago," she said sharply. "It has nothing to do with this." But Paris disagreed. Journalists dredged up old caricatures, old editorials, old jokes printed in the margins of history. They compared the two events side by side, drawing lines whether or not the facts supported them. In doing so, they transformed Marguerite from a woman in mourning into a symbol of decadence, of moral decay, of everything dangerous about the Belle Époque. And symbols do not receive the benefit of doubt. The police were careful. They had no evidence, yet, no witness who could contradict her account, no physical proof tying her to the murders. Arresting her without cause would turn suspicion into martyrdom. But they did not trust her. Not her calm, not her consistency, not her timing. One inspector, older and less impressed by reputation, put it plainly. Some people bring storms with them. Wherever they go, something breaks. Marguerite Steinheil sat alone that night, no longer in her house but in a guarded room, wrapped in borrowed clothing, outside. Paris debated her guilt as though it were already a foregone conclusion. She stared ahead, expression unreadable. She had survived scandal once before. She knew how this worked. The city would feast, then move on, unless given reason to stay. And somewhere beneath the layers of composure, beneath the carefully arranged calm, Marguerite understood something the rest of Paris had not yet grasped. This time, the past was not just catching up to her, it was preparing to testify. Before Paris learned to fear the name Marguerite Steinheil, before newspapers sharpened it into a weapon, she was simply Marguerite Jean Japy, a girl born far from intrigue, blood, and locked rooms. She entered the world on April 16, 1869, in Beaucourt, a quiet industrial town in northeastern France, close enough to the German border that the memory of war never fully left the land. It was not a place where legends were born. It was a place of routine, of factories and schedules, of respectability carefully maintained. Marguerite's family belonged to the upper edge of the middle class, prosperous enough to feel secure, disciplined enough to fear scandal. Her father, Edouard Japy, was a successful industrialist, methodical, ambitious, and deeply conscious of appearances. Her mother, Émilie, came from humbler origins, the daughter of an innkeeper, quieter in temperament, accustomed to adapting rather than commanding. From an early age, Marguerite learned to observe. She learned when to speak and when silence was more useful. She learned how a smile could soften a refusal, how posture could signal confidence even when certainty was absent. These were not lessons formally taught, but absorbed. As children absorb the rules of their environment without realizing they are being trained. Unlike most girls in Beaucourt, Marguerite was educated seriously. She had a governess. She studied languages. She read widely. Her father believed refinement was an investment, and Marguerite proved a quick return. She was intelligent, curious, and possessed of an unusual awareness of how she was perceived by others. People noticed her, not only for her beauty, though that would come to define her later, but for her presence. Even as a young girl, she did not fade into rooms. She seemed to arrive in them. Edouard Japy adored her. Of all his children, Marguerite was the one who mirrored his ambition. He spoke to her as though she were older than she was, entrusted her with opinions, encouraged her to think beyond the narrow expectations laid out for women of her station. He wanted her to marry well, of course, but more than that, he wanted her to matter. Her mother worried. Émilie saw something restless in her daughter, something unsatisfied by the rhythms of provincial life. She warned her gently, repeatedly, that attention was dangerous, that visibility invited judgment. Marguerite listened, but did not internalize the lesson. At 17, she fell in love, or something close enough to it. The young man was a friend of her brother's, educated, charming, unsuitable. Their relationship progressed too quickly, too openly, and when Edouard discovered it, he intervened with decisive authority. The affair was ended, not through persuasion, but through command. Marguerite did not argue. She complied, but something hardened in her during that moment. Not resentment, something colder, a recognition that affection, when uncontrolled, was a liability. That power belonged to those who chose when and how to reveal themselves. In 1888, Edouard Japy died suddenly of a heart attack. Marguerite was 19. The loss shattered the careful structure of her world. Her father had been the axis around which her ambitions quietly revolved, the figure who had validated her sense of exception. Without him, Beaucourt felt smaller, quieter, suffocating. Her grief was real, but grief, like everything else, became a catalyst. It was after her father's death that Marguerite began to speak of Paris, not as a dream, but as a destination. She read about it obsessively, the salons, the art, the politics, the women who mattered not because of birth, but because of proximity to power. Paris was not merely a city, it was a stage, and Marguerite understood, even then, that she was not meant to live her life unseen. Her mother resisted the idea at first. Paris devoured women like Marguerite. She warned, women who believed intelligence and beauty were enough to protect them. But Marguerite was patient. She waited. She framed her desire not as rebellion, but as inevitability. By the time she left Beaucourt, it felt less like escape and more like fulfillment of something long overdue. She did not yet know the names Félix Faure or Adolphe Steinheil. She did not yet understand how closely sex, power, and death could intertwine. She had not yet learned how survival could depend on composure rather than innocence. But the foundation was already there. The discipline, the awareness, the refusal to be ordinary. And as the train carried her away from the quiet certainty of her childhood, one truth followed her into the future. Unnoticed but intact, Marguerite Steinheil would never be a woman history forgot. She would only be a woman history could not agree on. Marguerite did not go directly to Paris before the city could claim her. She paused in Bayonne, in the south of France, visiting her sister and allowing herself, at least on the surface, a moment of restraint. She was barely 20, recently unmoored by her father's death, and outwardly obedient to the expectations still pressing in on her from Beaucourt. It was there that she met Adolphe Steinheil. He was nearly twice her age, an artist by trade and temperament, with the kind of confidence that came not from success, but from proximity to it. His father, Louis Charles Steinheil, had been a respected painter, responsible for frescoes that still adorned the Cathedral of Strasbourg. Adolphe himself lived in the long shadow of that reputation, talented enough to be taken seriously, but never celebrated enough to feel secure. Marguerite fascinated him immediately. She was young, composed, and attentive in a way that made men feel seen without being challenged. She listened carefully, asked questions that suggested admiration, and never corrected him, even when she knew better. To Adolphe, she appeared both cultivated and unclaimed, a rare combination. To Marguerite, Adolphe represented access. He was connected. He belonged, however loosely, to the artistic circles of Paris. He could take her there, not as a visitor, but as a wife, respectable, proper, untouchable, at least in theory. The courtship was swift. By 1890, they were married, and Marguerite Jean Japy became Marguerite Steinheil. With the name came a new identity, one that fit more comfortably into the world she intended to enter. Paris received them during the height of the Belle Époque. It was a city intoxicated with itself, art, literature, music, and politics colliding in cafes that never truly slept. Painters argued beside poets, politicians drank with actresses, boundaries blurred easily, and reputations were made as often in bedrooms as in galleries. The Steinheils did not live extravagantly, but they lived inside the moment. They attended salons. They frequented cabarets. They stood close enough to greatness to feel its heat, even if it never quite warmed them. Marguerite flourished. She learned how to move through rooms without drawing attention too quickly, how to let others speak first, how to make men feel clever, important, indispensable. Beauty opened doors, but it was her discretion that kept them open. Adolphe struggled. His work earned modest commissions, but not acclaim. He watched his wife draw interest effortlessly while he labored for recognition that never fully arrived. At first, he was proud of her, then uneasy, then quietly resentful. A child was born, a daughter, within the first year of marriage. For a brief moment, domestic life imposed structure, responsibility, routine. It did not last. The marriage began to fracture not through scandal, but through distance, emotional, intellectual, ambitional. Marguerite's world expanded outward. Adolphe's folded inward. They argued rarely, but meaningfully. Silence became their primary mode of communication. Eventually, they lived apart, not divorced, never that. Appearances still mattered, but separate enough that Marguerite was free to inhabit Paris on her own terms. Adolphe, for his part, accepted the arrangement with weary pragmatism. He knew of her affairs. He did not protest. In fact, he benefited. Many of Marguerite's admirers commissioned paintings from Adolphe. Through her connections, his income stabilized, his career survived, if not gloriously, then comfortably. Their marriage became transactional, held together by mutual convenience rather than affection. It was during this period that Marguerite crossed an invisible threshold. She entered the demi-monde, the half-world between respectability and disgrace, inhabited by women who were neither wives nor prostitutes, but something far more dangerous: independent, courtesans, socialites, confidants, women whose value lay in access, discretion, and influence. Marguerite was exceptionally good at it. She curated her reputation carefully. She was never crude, never overt. Her relationships were discreet, selective, and strategic. She understood that power did not come from excess, but from scarcity, from being desired but never fully possessed. Men spoke of her in lowered voices. Women watched her with unease. She built a salon not merely as a gathering place, but as a filtering system, deciding who belonged in her orbit and who did not. Politics brushed against art. Influence passed silently across small tables. Marguerite listened more than she spoke, and remembered everything. It was inevitable that someone like Félix Faure would eventually notice her, a man climbing steadily through the ranks of French political life. Faure was ambitious, disciplined, and hungry for affirmation. By the mid-1890s, he had become president of the French Republic, an achievement few had predicted when he began. When Marguerite entered his awareness in 1897, she was already fully formed. She was no longer the girl from Beaucourt, no longer merely a painter's wife. She was a woman who understood how proximity to power could reshape destiny. And when Félix Faure stepped into her life, neither of them could have known that their private indulgence would soon collide with public catastrophe. But the conditions were already set. A marriage that no longer bound, a woman skilled in discretion, a man accustomed to control. All that remained was the moment when secrecy failed and history took notice. By the late 1890s, Marguerite Steinheil no longer needed to announce her arrival. Paris did it for her. She had learned the city's rhythms quickly, how influence moved not through declarations but through dinners, favors, and carefully timed intimacy. She understood that the men who mattered most rarely appeared dangerous at first glance. They wore respectability like armor, hiding their appetites behind titles and offices. Marguerite did not challenge that armor. She slipped around it. Her salon became a space of calculated ambiguity. Nothing overtly scandalous occurred there, at least not in ways that could be proven. Conversations drifted from art to politics to personal confession with ease. Guests left feeling lighter, understood, and, most importantly, indebted. She was never desperate. That was her greatest strength. Marguerite accepted lovers selectively, ending relationships before they grew inconvenient. She did not cling. She did not beg. She allowed men to believe they were choosing her, even as she guided their choices with subtle precision. To some, she was generous. To others, unreachable. Both impressions were deliberate. The term courtesan did not carry the same vulgarity in Belle Époque Paris that it would later acquire. A woman like Marguerite occupied a paradoxical position, excluded from polite society, yet welcomed everywhere that power gathered after dark. She existed outside moral absolutes, judged harshly but sought relentlessly. She understood the bargain. Her beauty was an asset, but not her primary one. Beauty faded. Discretion did not, nor did memory. Marguerite listened carefully, storing fragments of information that others dismissed as harmless. Grievances, ambitions, weaknesses. She never threatened. She never exposed. The very fact that she could was enough. It was through this world that Félix Faure became more than a name. By the time he noticed Marguerite, he was already a man shaped by compromise. His rise from modest origins to the presidency of the French Republic had been steady, cautious, and politically calculated. Publicly, he embodied stability. Privately, he chafed against the weight of office and the restraint it imposed. Marguerite offered an escape. Their relationship began quietly in 1897, arranged through intermediaries who understood discretion as a professional necessity. Meetings were sporadic at first, carefully spaced, deliberately informal. There was no talk of love, no illusions of permanence, only indulgence. Faure trusted Marguerite because she never demanded more than he was willing to give. She did not ask for money. She did not leverage his position. She did not speak his name outside private rooms. In return, he offered access, glimpses into the inner machinery of the state, opinions shared without caution, moments of unguarded vulnerability. It was dangerous, and they both knew it. As months passed, their encounters grew bolder. What began in discreet apartments migrated toward the very center of power. The Élysée Palace, symbol of the Republic, became a place not only of governance, but of secrecy. Marguerite understood the risk more clearly than Faure did. She knew that proximity to the presidency magnified everything: desire, scandal, consequence. She also knew that such proximity, once achieved, could not be easily reversed. History rarely forgot the women who moved close to kings. By early 1899, the political climate had turned volatile. France was still deeply divided by the Dreyfus affair, a wound that refused to close. Accusations of treason, anti-Semitism, and institutional corruption saturated public discourse. Faure had positioned himself firmly against reopening the case, a stance that earned him enemies across ideological lines. Marguerite watched this tension carefully. She heard the anger in voices at her salon. She sensed the pressure building around Faure, the fatigue in his demeanor when they met. He was aging. His health was deteriorating. He dismissed concerns with practiced confidence, but his body betrayed him in subtle ways. Still, the meetings continued. On February 16th, 1899, Marguerite was summoned to the Élysée Palace. What occurred in that room would later be reduced to rumor, caricature, and cruel humor. Details would be distorted, sensationalized, weaponized. What remained consistent was the ending. Félix Faure collapsed. Doctors were called, doors were closed. The machinery of state moved swiftly to contain what could not be undone. By evening, the President of France was dead. Marguerite vanished from view. No official statement named her. No investigation questioned her presence. The Republic closed ranks, presenting a sanitized narrative to the public. Faure, they said, had died of natural causes. His heart had failed him. There was nothing more to explain. Paris did not believe them, though Marguerite was never charged, never formally accused. The city absorbed her into its mythology. Jokes circulated in cafes. Cartoons appeared in underground publications. Her name became shorthand for decadence, excess, and fatal temptation. She survived, but she was marked. In the years that followed, Marguerite adjusted. She learned when to retreat and when to reappear. She understood that notoriety, like desire, could be managed if approached with discipline. Her salon reopened, her circle reformed, life, outwardly, continued. But something had shifted. Death was no longer abstract, scandal was no longer hypothetical. Marguerite Steinheil had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had been present at the fall of a president, and history had noticed, even if it pretended not to. And when, nearly a decade later, death returned to her life in a far more intimate form, Paris would remember this chapter well, because to many, the question was no longer if Marguerite Steinheil was dangerous, but how. By the time Félix Faure was laid to rest, France was already at war with itself, not with armies or borders, but with truth. The Dreyfus affair had been festering for years by the time the president died, an open wound in the body of the Republic. In 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, had been accused of passing military secrets to Germany. The evidence was thin. The verdict was swift. He was convicted, publicly humiliated, and sent to rot on Devil's Island. But the story refused to end there. Journalists, intellectuals, and former allies of the state began to uncover inconsistencies, documents forged, testimony manipulated, facts ignored. What should have been a closed case reopened again and again in the public imagination. France split into camps, those who demanded justice and those who demanded order at any cost. At the center of that split stood Félix Faure as president. He refused to reopen the case. To him, revisiting Dreyfus meant admitting institutional failure, something the Republic could not afford. His stance earned him loyalty from conservatives and fury from reformers. He became a symbol not merely of governance, but of obstruction. And symbols attract enemies. In this atmosphere, nothing happened in isolation. Every death, every scandal, every private indulgence was interpreted through a political lens. When Faure collapsed so suddenly, so privately, suspicion followed instinctively. Officially, his death was natural. Unofficially, questions multiplied. Some whispered that stress had killed him. Others suggested excess. But in darker corners of Paris, a different narrative began to circulate, one far more dangerous and far less grounded in fact. They spoke of Marguerite Steinheil, according to rumor. She had not merely been present when Faure died, she had been instrumental. Some claimed she had overheard confidential discussions about Dreyfus. Others alleged she had been entrusted with sensitive documents. Still others, emboldened by the era's deep-rooted anti-Semitism, accused her of acting on behalf of a shadowy Jewish syndicate determined to remove the president for blocking a retrial. There was no evidence, none, but evidence mattered less than atmosphere. Marguerite found herself pulled into a conspiracy she had no control over, woven into a political drama she neither authored nor benefited from. She became a convenient figure onto whom fears could be projected, a woman already tainted by scandal, already viewed as morally suspect. The logic was simple, and therefore persuasive to many. A woman capable of corrupting a president was capable of anything. Marguerite denied every allegation, calmly, firmly, publicly when forced, privately when allowed. She insisted she had never handled documents, never discussed politics with Faure. never acted on behalf of anyone but herself. And for once, the facts supported her. No papers were ever produced, no witness corroborated the rumors, no trail led anywhere but back to speculation. Gradually, as France's attention shifted and the Dreyfus affair dragged on, the accusations lost momentum, but reputations do not recover simply because lies fade. Marguerite remained, in the public imagination, a woman adjacent to power and danger. Her name surfaced whenever politics turned sour, whenever trust in institutions weakened. She was invoked not because she had done something, but because she represented something unsettling. She endured it by adapting. Her salon reopened with greater selectivity. Her circle narrowed. She avoided overt political discussion, focusing instead on art, culture, and personal connection. Those who continued to visit her did so knowing the risks, and often because of them. Her husband, Adolphe Steinheil, remained in the background throughout it all. He understood the rumors. He read the papers. He knew his wife's name was spoken with a mix of desire and contempt. And yet, he said little. He accepted commissions arranged through Marguerite's connections. He lived comfortably, if quietly, on the periphery of her notoriety. Their marriage survived not through affection, but through mutual tolerance. Years passed. The Dreyfus affair finally reached its conclusion in 1906, when Alfred Dreyfus was officially exonerated. France exhaled, exhausted by the ordeal. The political storm that had consumed the nation slowly dissipated, leaving behind scars and resentments, but also a desire to move on. Marguerite believed the same might be possible for her. She was wrong, because while public scandals may fade, private resentments accumulate, and whatever truth lay beneath the rumors surrounding Félix IV. They had accomplished one irreversible thing. They had taught France how to look at Marguerite Steinheil, not as a woman shaped by circumstance, but as a catalyst. And when? 2 years later, violence erupted within her own home. The nation already knew how it wanted to interpret her role. All that remained was proof. By 1908, Marguerite Steinheil believed the worst was behind her. The storms of politics had moved on. The Dreyfus affair was officially closed. Félix IV had become a footnote, still whispered about, still joked over in cafes, but no longer capable of reshaping her daily life. Paris, fickle as ever, had found newer scandals to consume. Outwardly, her life settled into something resembling stability. She and Adolphe lived once more under the same roof at Impasse Ronsin, a modest but respectable residence tucked away from the main arteries of the city. The arrangement was practical rather than intimate. They occupied separate emotional territories, intersecting only when necessary. Bound by habit and shared history rather than affection, Marguerite's mother, Émilie Japy, lived with them. Age had softened Émilie but not silenced her unease. She disapproved quietly of her daughter's past and worried openly about her future. Paris had never forgiven Marguerite. She said, "It was not a city that forgot women who stepped outside their assigned roles." Marguerite dismissed the concern. She was nearing 40 now, no longer young, but still commanding attention. Her salon continued, smaller and more controlled than before. She chose her guests carefully. She avoided unnecessary drama. If she had learned anything from the past decade, it was that survival depended on anticipation. Adolphe, meanwhile, drifted. His career remained modest. Commissions came irregularly. He spent long hours alone in his studio, painting with the persistence of a man who believed recognition was always one canvas away. There was no evidence of overt hostility between husband and wife. But neither was there warmth. They coexisted, each inhabiting a private interior life the other did not enter. To outsiders, the household appeared calm, too calm, perhaps. Those who knew them casually described the Steinheil home as subdued. No frequent visitors late at night, no loud arguments, no visible threats. The very ordinariness of it all would later trouble investigators deeply. On the evening of May 30th, 1908, nothing seemed unusual. Marguerite dined lightly. Adolphe retired early to work. Émilie went to bed as she always did. There were no reported quarrels, no raised voices overheard by neighbors. The narrow street outside remained quiet, untouched by the chaos soon to be imposed upon it. And yet, beneath the surface, tensions existed, unspoken, undocumented, and therefore invisible to history. Marguerite had money troubles. Though she concealed them well, maintaining appearances was costly. The salon, while still influential, did not produce income as reliably as it once had. Adolphe's earnings were inconsistent. Dependence bred resentment, even when unacknowledged. Émilie worried about their future. She pressed Marguerite to consider change, perhaps leaving Paris, perhaps reconciling fully with her husband, perhaps retreating into anonymity. Marguerite listened, but her patience was thin. Anonymity had never protected her before. She doubted it would now. That night, the house went dark as usual. What happened next would never be fully reconstructed. There were no witnesses, no neighbors heard screams. No clear timeline emerged, the sequence of events, who was attacked first, how resistance unfolded, when Marguerite was bound, remained uncertain from the start. All that could be said with confidence was this. By dawn, Adolphe Steinheil and Émilie Japy were dead, strangled inside the home they shared with Marguerite, and Marguerite herself was found alive, restrained, and waiting. The police would later attempt to map motive onto the silence. Was it robbery gone wrong? Revenge? An inside job? Nothing fit cleanly. The household had not been wealthy enough to justify a violent burglary. No known enemies had threatened Adolphe. Émilie's life had been unremarkable. Her conflicts domestic and limited. If the crime had been personal. Why spare Marguerite? If it had been impersonal. Why leave no trace? The answers refused to assemble. What troubled investigators most was not what had happened, but what had not. No blood, no chaos, no frantic attempts at escape. The scene suggested deliberation rather than impulse, planning rather than panic, and at the center of it all sat Marguerite Steinheil, offering a story that accounted for everything and explained nothing. In the days following the murders, she behaved impeccably. She complied with questioning. She did not flee. She did not hide. She dressed in mourning black and maintained composure in public. Even as newspapers speculated freely about her involvement, grief, when it appeared, did so in measured intervals, never overwhelming, never inconvenient. To some, this restraint suggested innocence under shock. To others, it suggested rehearsal. The police were cautious. They knew that arresting Marguerite without evidence would ignite outrage and speculation. Her past ensured that any misstep would be scrutinized as political persecution or moral bias. And yet, allowing her to remain free felt increasingly irresponsible. She was not accused, yet, but she was no longer merely a witness. As the investigation deepened, the Steinheil affair began to take shape, not as a straightforward murder case, but as a psychological maze where every certainty dissolved upon closer inspection, and slowly, almost imperceptibly. The question shifted, not who had killed Adolphe Steinheil and Émilie Japy, but whether Marguerite Steinheil had ever truly been in danger at all. In the weeks that followed the murders, Paris settled into a familiar rhythm of judgment. The police continued their work methodically, but the public had already reached its conclusions, or at least chosen its favorites. Some papers portrayed Marguerite Steinheil as a woman crushed by misfortune, twice marked by death through no fault of her own. Others painted her as something far darker, a survivor whose talent lay not in innocence, but in endurance. The investigation moved slowly. And deliberately, officers retraced Marguerite's version of events hour by hour, searching for cracks. They questioned neighbors, servants, acquaintances. They examined the locks again, the windows, the cords used to bind her wrists. Nothing offered the certainty they needed, but doubt does not require proof to grow. One detail in particular refused to fade: the intruders. 4 men. Marguerite insisted. Always 4, all dressed in black, their faces hidden, efficient, silent, coordinated. It was a description so precise it bordered on theatrical. And yet, no witness had seen anyone enter or leave Impasse Ronson that night. No unusual footprints were found, no discarded clothing, no trace of an escape. If 4 men had come, they had done so invisibly. The police also revisited Marguerite's suggestion of a former servant. At first, the idea seemed plausible. Servants knew routines, they knew houses, they knew where valuables were kept. But as investigators followed the thread, it frayed quickly. The man she named had an alibi. So did those loosely connected to him. No credible motive emerged. Still, the act of redirecting suspicion did not go unnoticed. To seasoned investigators, it felt premature, too eager, as though Marguerite were not merely responding to questions, but shaping them. They began to observe her more closely. She never contradicted herself outright, but her statements shifted subtly depending on who was listening. Time blurred when it suited her. Certainty hardened when challenged. She appeared cooperative, yet oddly detached from outcomes that should have terrified her. And then there was the matter of the knots. Experts examined the bindings used on Marguerite's wrists and concluded they were simple, functional, but not rushed. The cord had been tied in a manner suggesting familiarity rather than force. More troubling still, there was no evidence she had attempted to loosen them during the hours she claimed to have been left alone. When asked why, she replied simply, "I believed they would return." It was a reasonable answer. It was also convenient. By late summer, the pressure intensified. Public patience wore thin. Newspapers demanded action. Editorials questioned the competence of the police. Rumors hardened into accusations. Marguerite was summoned repeatedly for further questioning. Each time, she arrived composed, dressed appropriately, controlled. She never appeared confused, never overwhelmed. Even her grief seemed disciplined, emerging only when socially expected, retreating when scrutiny increased. To some, she appeared remarkably strong. To others, remarkably prepared. In November of 1908, nearly 6 months after the murders, the authorities made their move. They did not arrest Marguerite for murder. They arrested her for tampering with evidence. It was a careful decision, legally defensible and strategically sound. The charge allowed them to detain her without proving what they could not yet establish. It also sent a clear signal. The state no longer accepted her story at face value. Marguerite Steinheil was taken into custody and transferred to Saint Lazare prison. The building itself carried a history heavy enough to intimidate anyone. Originally a medieval leper house, it had become, over centuries, a place where society stored its inconvenient women, criminals, the mentally ill, the morally suspect. To be sent there was not merely detention, it was classification. Marguerite entered Saint Lazare not as a condemned woman, but as a problem. Her reaction surprised many. She did not protest. She did not collapse. She did not plead. Witnesses noted that she walked into the prison with her head high, her expression unreadable, as though she were stepping into a role she had long anticipated. Inside, she adapted quickly. She learned the routines, the hierarchies, the unspoken rules. She spoke little, observed much, and maintained a distance that discouraged intimacy. Even in confinement, she retained something of the authority she had exercised in salons. Outside the walls, anticipation built. The trial was inevitable now. Paris prepared for it with a hunger bordering on obsession. Tickets would be coveted, opinions would harden. Marguerite's past would be dragged into the light, examined not for relevance, but for spectacle. The question was no longer whether she would face judgment, it was what kind of judgment France wanted to deliver. In a nation still scarred by political division and moral anxiety. Marguerite Steinheil stood poised to become something larger than herself, a test case of justice, of prejudice, of how far a woman could deviate from expectation before society demanded punishment. And as she waited behind the walls of Saint Lazare, one thing became clear to everyone watching. Whatever the truth of that night at Impasse Ronsin, the trial would not be about facts alone. It would be about who Marguerite Steinheil was allowed to be, and whether France was prepared to let her live with the answer. Saint Lazare prison was not built to redeem, it was built to contain. By the time Marguerite Steinheil passed through its gates in late 1908, the building had already lived several lives: leper house, asylum, prison, each era layering new forms of isolation onto old stone. Its corridors smelled of damp air and resignation. Its walls had heard confessions no court ever recorded. Marguerite entered not as a convicted criminal, but as a woman the state no longer trusted. Inside, she was stripped of status immediately. Fine clothes replaced with institutional gray. Personal effects catalogued. Examined. Removed. Her name entered into a register alongside thieves, sex workers, and women deemed morally unstable. Saint Lazare did not differentiate between crimes of violence and crimes of reputation. To the system, they were equally disruptive. Marguerite understood this faster than most. She did not resist the routines. She rose when instructed, ate when permitted, spoke only when necessary. Guards noted her composure with suspicion. Too calm, too observant. She studied the prison the way she once studied salons, mapping hierarchies, understanding power dynamics, learning who watched and who was watched. Other inmates watched her in return. They knew her name. Some whispered it with admiration, others with resentment, a few with open hostility. Marguerite represented something dangerous to them, not privilege. Exactly, but exception. A woman who had moved among presidents and artists now sharing air with those society had already discarded. She did not attempt to dominate the space. She isolated herself instead, in the evenings. She wrote letters, measured, articulate, controlled, to lawyers, to acquaintances who still owed her favors, to anyone who might help shape the narrative before it hardened beyond repair. She knew the trial would be fought as much in newspapers as in court, and the newspapers were already sharpening their knives. Every detail of her past resurfaced. Her youth in Beaucourt, her marriage to Adolphe Steinheil, her affairs. Félix Faure, always Félix Faure. Headlines questioned her morality as though it were evidence. Editorials speculated freely about motive, ignoring the absence of proof. Illustrations exaggerated her features, turning her into something predatory, theatrical, almost mythic. She was no longer a defendant in waiting. She was a spectacle. The prosecution prepared carefully. They knew the case was fragile. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession. Circumstantial evidence at best. What they did have was atmosphere, suspicion cultivated over a decade. A woman whose reputation could be framed as character evidence without ever saying so outright. The charge remained evidence tampering, but the implication was clear. Marguerite Steinheil was believed capable of murder. Her defense understood the danger. They advised restraint, silence, emotional neutrality. Any display of anger could be reframed as guilt. Any display of sorrow as manipulation? Marguerite listened and refined her composure even further. She did not deny her past. She contextualized it. Yes, she had lovers. Yes, she had been present when Félix Faure died. Yes, she had lived a life outside conventional morality. But none of that proved she had strangled her husband and mother. Privately, she prepared herself for hostility. The presiding judge, it was rumored, had little patience for women like her. He had already referred to her statements as tissues of lies in preliminary remarks. The courtroom, when it finally convened, would not be neutral ground. Marguerite knew this was no longer about discovering the truth. It was about deciding which version of her France preferred: the victim, the seductress, the liar, the monster. As winter approached and the trial date loomed, Saint-Lazare closed in around her. Nights were long. Silence pressed heavily against the walls. She slept lightly, her mind replaying questions she had answered 100 times already, refining responses that might never be heard fairly. She did not break, if anything. Confinement sharpened her. Marguerite Steinheil had survived scandal, rumor, and isolation before. She understood that endurance itself could be a form of power. And when she was finally led from her cell toward the courtroom in 1909, she carried that understanding with her. Paris would judge her. But first, she would let Paris reveal itself. When the trial of Marguerite Steinheil opened in the summer of 1909, Paris treated it less like a legal proceeding and more like a theatrical premiere. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse hours before the doors opened. Tickets to observe the proceedings were coveted, passed between hands like currency. Journalists filled the benches, notebooks ready, already shaping headlines before a single word was spoken. The public did not come to learn the truth. They came to witness a reckoning. Marguerite arrived under guard, dressed in black. She did not avert her eyes. She did not bow her head. She moved with deliberate calm, aware that every step would be interpreted, every gesture weighed. To show fear would invite contempt. To show confidence would invite hatred. She walked the narrow line between them with practiced precision. The prosecution wasted no time. They did not begin with the night of the murders. They began with Marguerite herself, her character, her past, her choices. They spoke of her youth, her ambition, her refusal to accept the limits placed upon women of her class. They spoke of her affairs as if they were crimes, her independence as if it were evidence of moral deficiency. Félix Faure's name surfaced early and often, spoken with a mix of outrage and fascination. The implication was clear. A woman capable of corrupting a president was capable of killing her husband. It was not an argument grounded in facts. It was an argument grounded in feeling. Marguerite listened without reaction. When she was finally called to speak, she answered calmly, precisely, never raising her voice. She admitted what could not be denied. She corrected what could be proven false. She refused to speculate. When pressed aggressively, she responded with restraint rather than defensiveness. The judge interrupted her often. He questioned her credibility openly, referring to inconsistencies as deliberate deception rather than confusion at one point. He dismissed her testimony outright, calling it a tapestry of lies. The courtroom murmured in approval. Marguerite did not respond. Witnesses followed, neighbors who had heard nothing, servants whose recollections contradicted one another, experts who debated the significance of knots, bruises, timelines. Each piece of evidence, when examined alone, meant little. Together, they formed a fog rather than a picture. The prosecution leaned into that fog, suggesting that confusion itself was proof of manipulation. Marguerite's defense focused on absence. No weapon, no motive strong enough to justify such violence, no witness placing her in the act. They argued that suspicion was not evidence, that reputation was not guilt, that morality was not a legal category. They reminded the court that the charge was not murder, but evidence tampering, a tacit admission that proof of greater wrongdoing did not exist. The courtroom remained divided. Some spectators were convinced of her guilt regardless of the verdict to come. Others watched with growing discomfort, sensing that the trial had drifted from justice into something more symbolic. Marguerite felt it too. She realized that her greatest danger was not conviction, but narrative. If the court decided she represented something France wished to condemn, no acquittal would truly free her. And yet, as the trial progressed into autumn, cracks appeared. Witnesses contradicted themselves under pressure. Timelines refused to align. The theory of 4 intruders, while improbable, could not be disproven. The prosecution's case relied increasingly on suggestion rather than demonstration. Public confidence wavered by November. Fatigue had set in. The spectacle lost some of its luster. What remained was a simple question the court could no longer avoid. Was there enough evidence to condemn Marguerite Steinheil? When the verdict finally came, it did so quietly, not guilty. The courtroom erupted, not with celebration, but with disbelief. Some shouted in outrage, others applauded cautiously. Marguerite remained seated, absorbing the moment without visible relief. Freedom, when it arrived, felt abstract, fragile, conditional. She left the courthouse acquitted, but unchanged. Paris had not forgiven her. History had not resolved her. She was free by law, but still imprisoned by interpretation. And as Marguerite Steinheil stepped back into the world, she understood a final, unsettling truth. Survival did not mean innocence had been proven. It meant only that certainty had failed, and for the rest of her life. That ambiguity would be both her shield and her sentence. Freedom did not feel like release. When Marguerite Steinheil walked out of the courthouse in November 1909, the cold Paris air struck her with a force she had not anticipated. It was not relief that filled her lungs, but exposure. The law had stepped aside. But the public had not. Outside the stone steps, faces watched her with open disappointment, as though justice itself had failed to deliver a more satisfying ending. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a question left unresolved. Reporters surged forward, shouting her name, demanding statements she refused to give. Cameras captured her profile, her controlled expression, the absence of visible triumph. That restraint would be interpreted in a dozen contradictory ways by the next morning's papers. For some, it proved guilt. For others, dignity. For most, it only deepened the mystery. Marguerite returned briefly to Impasse Ronsin. The house was no longer a home. It was a relic, sealed, scrutinized, emptied of warmth. Every room echoed with memory. Every surface carried an invisible weight. She did not linger. Paris had transformed the space into a symbol, and she understood that symbols were not safe places to remain. Adolphe Steinheil was gone. Her mother was gone, and whatever version of herself had once lived there was gone as well. Within weeks, she made a decision she had resisted for years. She would leave France, not in disgrace, at least not officially, not in exile, but in retreat. England offered distance, anonymity, and a public less invested in her mythology. Paris, by contrast, had already decided what she represented, even if it could not decide what she had done. Before departing, Marguerite arranged for her daughter, long absent from her daily life, to remain with her deceased father's extended family. The separation was not mutual. It was imposed, formalized, and devastating in its finality. For years, Mother and child would have no contact, a quiet punishment that no court had ordered but society had enforced. In the early 1910s, Marguerite settled in London. The city received her differently. English society was curious, but restrained. Her name carried intrigue, not outrage. She was no longer a living scandal, merely a story from across the channel. That distance softened her edges, allowing her to reassemble an identity less burdened by expectation. She changed little about herself outwardly. She remained articulate, composed, selective, but something essential had shifted. The salons were smaller, the risks fewer. The ambition, once so sharp, had dulled into something closer to preservation. In 1912, she published her memoirs. The book was not a confession, nor was it an apology. It was a defense, carefully structured, meticulously worded, and emotionally restrained. Marguerite presented herself as a woman misunderstood by history. Caught in the violent currents of male power and political hysteria, critics were divided. Some dismissed the memoirs as self-serving, others found them compelling in their restraint. Noting what she chose not to say as carefully as what she did, scholars would later dissect the text for insight into how women accused in Belle Époque France constructed their own narratives of survival. Marguerite, for her part, seemed indifferent to reception. The book was not written to convince everyone. It was written to exist. Years passed quietly. In 1917, she married again, this time to Robert Scarlett, a British lawyer and minor peer, the sixth Baron Abinger. The marriage was stable, unremarkable, and notably free of scandal. Marguerite was nearing 50. There would be no children, no salons, no return to notoriety. It was, in many ways, the life she had once been warned to choose. When Robert Scarlett died in 1927, Marguerite did not return to France. She remained in England, living modestly in the South, increasingly removed from the world that had once obsessed over her every move. She died on July 17, 1954, at the age of 85, in the seaside town of Hove. No crowds gathered, no scandals followed, no verdict was revised. Her death passed quietly, almost anonymously, a stark contrast to the life she had lived, and yet, her story refused to end. Historians continue to argue, was she a victim of coincidence and misogyny? Crushed beneath suspicion she could never escape? Or was she something far more calculating? A woman who understood power too well to be entirely innocent? The truth remains elusive. Perhaps that is the final irony of Marguerite Steinheil. She survived every scandal, outlived every accusation, escaped every definitive judgment. But in doing so, she left behind a legacy not of answers, only of questions that history still cannot agree on. Long after Marguerite Steinheil disappeared from the streets of Paris, her shadow stayed behind. It lingered in archives and footnotes, in half-remembered jokes and unfinished arguments. Each generation that returned to her story did so with the same uneasy fascination. Not because new evidence had emerged, but because the old questions refused to die. Who benefits from ambiguity, and who is punished by it? Historians approaching the Steinheil affair found themselves confronting more than a murder case. They confronted the anxieties of a society at the turn of the 20th century, a society uneasy with women who moved freely, spoke confidently, and refused to be reduced to victimhood. The facts, stripped of rumor, remained stubbornly thin. No proof ever tied Marguerite Steinheil directly to the deaths of her husband and mother. No confession surfaced. No witness placed her hands at their throats. The prosecution's failure was not procedural. It was evidentiary. And yet, belief persisted. Some scholars argue that Marguerite was protected by class, by connections, by a legal system reluctant to condemn without certainty. Others argue the opposite, that she was punished in every way that mattered except legally, subjected to a public trial where reputation served as evidence and survival as suspicion. the truth may lie somewhere less satisfying. Marguerite Steinheil was neither entirely powerless nor entirely omnipotent. She navigated systems built by men, exploiting gaps where they existed and suffering where they did not. She was intelligent, adaptable, and deeply aware of perception, but awareness is not the same as guilt. What unsettles historians most is not what she did, but how easily narratives replaced proof. Her sexuality became motive, her composure became deceit, her survival became accusation. Had Marguerite wept openly, perhaps she would have been believed more readily. Had she collapsed, begged, or broken, her innocence might have felt more convincing. Instead, she remained controlled, and control, in a woman like her, was intolerable. The Steinheil affair exposes a recurring pattern when facts fail to satisfy. Society supplies meaning, and meaning, once supplied, resists correction. Even today, documentaries and books frame her as a riddle rather than a person. Titles emphasize danger, seduction, and death. Rarely do they ask the quieter questions about grief managed in private, about endurance mistaken for calculation, about how often survival itself provokes resentment. Marguerite understood this better than anyone in her later years. She spoke little of Paris. She did not attempt to rehabilitate her image aggressively. She allowed the story to settle into myth, perhaps recognizing that myth was safer than renewed scrutiny. By refusing to explain herself endlessly, she denied the public the closure it craved, and that may have been her final act of control. Marguerite Steinheil died without resolution, but not without consequence. Her life remains a mirror held up to history, reflecting not a single truth, but the biases of those who look into it. Was she innocent? Was she guilty? The records do not say. What they reveal instead is something more uncomfortable: that justice, when filtered through desire, fear, and expectation, becomes indistinguishable from storytelling. Marguerite Steinheil did not leave behind a confession. She left behind a challenge to decide whether uncertainty is something to be feared or something to be respected. And as long as that question remains unanswered, her story will continue to be told, in the end. Marguerite Steinheil became something rarer than a criminal or a victim. She became a problem without a solution. Courts exist to close stories. Verdicts are meant to draw a line between what is known and what is finished, but the Steinheil affair refused to cooperate. It ended not with clarity, but with exhaustion, with a collective agreement to stop looking too closely. And that may be the most revealing outcome of all. Because what unsettled France was not merely the possibility that Marguerite Steinheil had committed murder. It was the possibility that she had not, and that the system designed to identify guilt was incapable of certainty when confronted with a woman like her. Marguerite did not behave as expected. She did not perform grief in a way that satisfied spectators. She did not plead for sympathy. She did not accept shame as penance. She remained composed in moments when chaos was demanded of her, and in the moral imagination of the time, composure was incompatible with innocence. Had she been poor, she might have been convicted. Had she been hysterical, she might have been believed. Had she been silent, she might have been forgotten. Instead, she occupied the narrow, dangerous space between those outcomes. Later commentators would argue endlessly about what must have happened inside the house at Impasse Rancine. Some reconstructed elaborate theories: secret lovers, financial desperation, staged intrusions. Others insisted the murders bore the unmistakable marks of an outsider. However invisible, but all such theories shared a flaw. They were driven by the need for resolution, not by evidence. The truth is simpler and more disturbing. We do not know. We do not know who strangled Adolphe Steinheil. We do not know who killed Émilie Japy. We do not know whether Marguerite Steinheil was a target, an accomplice, or merely the last woman standing in a series of tragedies. History is uncomfortable with that kind of ignorance, so it compensates. It turns ambiguity into character judgment. It fills gaps with implication. It confuses likelihood with proof. And once a story hardens in the public imagination, it becomes resistant to correction, even when correction is deserved. Marguerite's legacy, then, is not one of guilt or innocence. It is one of exposure. Her case exposes how quickly suspicion attaches to women who defy expectation, how easily sexuality is mistaken for motive, how often survival is interpreted as strategy rather than chance. It also exposes the limits of justice. The legal system did what it could with what it had. It refused to condemn without proof, but society demanded more than restraint. It demanded certainty, and when certainty failed, it redirected its frustration toward the woman who embodied the uncertainty itself. Marguerite Steinheil lived the rest of her life quietly, but not erased. She carried her past not as a burden to be confessed, but as a fact to be endured. In refusing to provide closure, she forced the world to sit with its discomfort. That may be why her story endures. Not because it is sensational, but because it is unresolved in an age obsessed with answers. Marguerite Steinheil left behind a question that refuses to age. What do we do when a woman survives the story we want her to fit into? Until that question is answered honestly, her name will continue to surface, not as a verdict, but as a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling truth is not what happened, but that we may never know. To understand why the story of Marguerite Steinheil still unsettles us, we must look beyond the crime and toward the era that tried to contain her. France at the turn of the 20th century was a nation balancing contradictions. It celebrated progress, reason, and modernity, yet clung fiercely to rigid ideas about gender, class, and morality. Women were permitted visibility only within carefully defined roles: wife, mother, muse. To step outside those boundaries was not illegal, but it was dangerous. Marguerite Steinheil lived almost entirely outside them. She was educated, articulate, and socially ambitious. She moved easily among politicians, artists, and intellectuals, not as a silent companion, but as a participant. She understood influence, cultivated relationships, and refused to pretend that her intelligence was accidental. To some, this made her impressive. To many others, it made her threatening. Her affair with President Félix Faure crystallized that threat. It was not merely adultery that offended the public. It was the implication that a woman like Marguerite could operate near the center of power without permission, without apology, and without immediate punishment. When Faure died suddenly in her presence, the scandal embedded itself permanently into her identity. From that moment on, death and Marguerite Steinheil became narratively linked, regardless of evidence. So when tragedy struck again in 1908, suspicion did not arrive neutrally. It arrived preloaded. Modern criminologists examining the case note how quickly investigators fixated on Marguerite. Despite the lack of forensic support, alternative explanations, botched robbery, unknown intruders, opportunistic violence were acknowledged, but never pursued with equal intensity. The investigation followed reputation rather than probability. This pattern is familiar to contemporary eyes. Studies of historical trials involving women show a recurring tendency. When motive is unclear, character fills the gap. Sexual independence becomes explanation. Emotional restraint becomes concealment. Complexity becomes calculation. Marguerite's greatest offense may have been that she refused to simplify herself. She was not consistently likable. She was not performatively innocent. She did not disappear quietly after surviving scandal. She persisted. From a modern feminist perspective, Marguerite Steinheil occupies an uncomfortable position. She cannot be easily reclaimed as a hero, nor dismissed as a villain. She benefited from privilege even as she suffered from misogyny. She exercised agency while navigating structures designed to punish that very agency. That ambiguity frustrates clean interpretation. We prefer stories with clear victims and clear perpetrators. We prefer narratives that reassure us about justice, about morality, about progress. Marguerite's story does none of those things. Instead, it asks whether fairness is possible when expectation precedes evidence. Even today, retellings of her life often lean toward sensationalism. Titles emphasize seduction and danger. Visual portrayals sharpen her features, darken her gaze, exaggerate her poise. She is rendered consumable, mysterious, erotic, suspicious. Rarely is she allowed to be ordinary in her suffering. Yet perhaps that is the most radical way to view her now. Not as a symbol, but as a woman caught between forces larger than herself. A woman who survived events that destroyed others. A woman whose refusal to collapse under scrutiny made her suspect in a culture that expected women to break. Marguerite Steinheil did not fit her time, and her time never forgave her for it. As we move further from the Belle Époque and closer to our own moment, one still grappling with power, gender, and narrative control, the question becomes less about her guilt or innocence. It becomes about us, about why we still need her to mean something, about why uncertainty still makes us uneasy, about why a woman who survives without explanation remains so difficult to accept. And in that sense, Marguerite Steinheil is no longer just a figure of the past. She is a mirror, held up to every era that encounters her story and insists, once again, on an answer she never gave. Once a life escapes the boundaries of its own time, it no longer belongs to the person who lived it. It becomes a construction. Marguerite Steinheil's transformation into myth did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, through repetition, through retellings that favored drama over doubt, through summaries that sharpened ambiguity into insinuation. Each retelling removed nuance, replacing it with certainty that felt emotionally satisfying, even when it was factually unsupported. By the mid-20th century, Marguerite was no longer introduced as a woman acquitted in a controversial case. She was introduced as the woman surrounded by death. Popular histories emphasized coincidence as destiny. They placed Félix Faur's collapse, the murders at Impasse Ronsin, and Marguerite's survival into a single, uninterrupted chain, as if proximity itself were proof of causation. The gaps between events disappeared. Context dissolved. What remained was an image. A beautiful woman, a powerful man, a sudden death, and later, a husband, a mother, a locked house. The story practically told itself, or so it seemed. Cinema, literature, and later television leaned into that ease. Fictionalized accounts exaggerated her intelligence into cunning, her composure into coldness. She was portrayed as either a femme fatale or a master manipulator, sometimes both. Rarely was she allowed to be uncertain, frightened, or overwhelmed. Myth requires consistency. Reality rarely provides it in these retellings. Marguerite's acquittal became an inconvenience rather than a conclusion. Writers framed it as a failure of justice, a loophole exploited, a technicality abused. The legal standard of proof was quietly replaced by moral judgment, and moral judgment by narrative instinct. If the story felt true, that was enough. But myth-making serves a purpose beyond entertainment. It simplifies anxiety. Marguerite Steinheil emerged during a period when traditional social hierarchies were under strain. Women were demanding greater autonomy, class boundaries were shifting, power was becoming less visible, less predictable. In that environment, a woman who moved freely among elites and survived scandal represented instability. Myth resolved that instability by giving her a role, not a woman navigating chaos, but chaos personified. Once Marguerite became a symbol, she ceased to require evidence. Symbols are not proved, they are interpreted, and interpretation is far more flexible than fact. Yet even myths have fractures. Modern scholars returning to primary sources, trial transcripts, police reports, correspondence, often express surprise at how thin the case against her actually was. The dramatic certainty of later portrayals simply does not exist in the original record. What exists instead is confusion, disagreement, and procedural restraint. In other words, uncertainty. And uncertainty does not age well. Each generation tends to project its own fears onto unresolved figures. In the 1920s, Marguerite symbolized moral decay. In the post-war years, she became an emblem of decadence. Later still, she was reframed as either a proto-feminist survivor or a cautionary tale about manipulation. She absorbed meaning without consent. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of her myth is how rarely her voice is centered. Her memoirs are quoted selectively. Her silences are filled aggressively. Her restraint is treated as strategy rather than temperament. The myth demands intention, but intention is precisely what the evidence fails to establish. Marguerite Steinheil did not leave behind a manifesto. She did not orchestrate her legacy. She simply lived, made choices, endured consequences, adapted when necessary. The myth grew not because she shaped it, but because others needed it to exist. And so, the woman faded while the idea remained. An idea easier to judge than to understand, easier to dramatize than to contextualize. As time passes, the distance between Marguerite Steinheil and Marguerite Steinheil only widens. One was a human being, constrained by circumstance. The other is a narrative device, endlessly repurposed. The challenge for any honest retelling is not to resolve her story, but to resist completing it artificially, to allow contradiction, to sit with doubt, to acknowledge that sometimes history does not hand us answers, only echoes, and in those echoes, Marguerite Steinheil continues to move, not as a villain, not as a heroine, but as a reminder that myth begins where certainty ends, and that once a woman becomes a symbol, the truth must fight to be heard at all. If the Steinheil affair still matters, it is not because it offers a solution, but because it exposes a pattern that repeats far beyond its own time. The case teaches us how quickly systems abandon neutrality when discomfort enters the room. From the moment Marguerite Steinheil was identified as the surviving woman, the investigation tilted. Survival itself became suspect. Her presence at multiple deaths was treated not as coincidence to be examined, but as implication to be assumed. This shift, from inquiry to interpretation, marks the point at which justice begins to blur into narrative. Modern legal theory recognizes this phenomenon clearly. When evidence is insufficient, prosecutors often lean on character. When character is ambiguous, culture supplies judgment, and when judgment hardens, it becomes resistant to contradiction. Even in the face of acquittal, Marguerite's case demonstrates how that process unfolds. She was never convicted of murder, yet she was never released from suspicion. Her acquittal resolved nothing in the public mind because the trial itself had not been about determining truth. It had been about restoring moral order, and moral order demanded a culprit. What makes this especially instructive is how gender shaped that demand. A man surviving similar circumstances might have been viewed as fortunate, or at worst, unlucky. Marguerite was viewed as anomalous, and anomaly, in patriarchal systems, often reads as threat. Her sexuality became interpretive shorthand. Her composure became evidence of deceit. Her intelligence became calculation. These associations were not proven. They were presumed. The case also highlights the limits of memory. Over time, the details most resistant to recall were the ones least useful to storytelling. Contradictory witness statements faded. Procedural safeguards disappeared. What endured were images: a woman in black, a locked room, a fallen president. Memory favors coherence over accuracy. This matters because unresolved cases rarely remain unresolved in the cultural imagination. They are resolved emotionally, not evidentially. People decide what feels true and move forward accordingly, leaving formal uncertainty behind. Marguerite Steinheil's story is one of those emotional resolutions. It also teaches us something quieter, but perhaps more important: that endurance is often misread. Marguerite did not collapse under scrutiny. She adapted. She relocated. She rebuilt. She lived for decades beyond the moment history tried to freeze her in place. That survival unsettled observers who expected punishment, repentance, or disappearance. Her refusal to vanish became a provocation. In modern terms, her life challenges a deeply ingrained expectation that women implicated in scandal must either be redeemed through suffering or erased through shame. Marguerite did neither. She endured without permission. That, too, became suspect. The Steinheil affair reminds us that justice is not only a legal process, it is a cultural one. Verdicts may close cases, but societies continue judging long after courts have spoken, and those judgments often reveal more about collective fear than individual guilt. We return to Marguerite Steinheil not because her story is exceptional, but because it is familiar. We recognize the pattern. We have seen it before. And we see it still. A woman survives. Certainty fails. Narrative fills the gap. The lesson is not to declare Marguerite innocent or guilty once and for all. The lesson is to question why we need her to be either, and to ask, more honestly than history often allows, when evidence ends, should judgment follow, or should restraint? Marguerite Steinheil's case does not answer that question. It asks it, and perhaps that is why, more than a century later, her story remains unfinished, not because the truth is hidden, but because uncertainty, once exposed, cannot be undone. Long after the case files were sealed and the witnesses faded into obscurity, one place remained stubbornly present in every retelling: Impasse Ronsin. The narrow street itself changed little over the years. Paris rebuilt around it, modernized, moved on, but the house where Adolphe Steinheil and Émilie Japy died resisted narrative closure. It became less a location and more a symbol, a physical anchor for unresolved suspicion. For investigators at the time, the house was a puzzle that never quite fit together. The doors were locked, the windows intact, no clear point of entry. This apparent impossibility fueled the most enduring accusation against Marguerite Steinheil, that the crime must have been an inside job, because the house appeared sealed from the outside. The theory was simple, seductive, and flawed. Later architectural analyses suggested alternative explanations: overlooked access points, assumptions about locks that were never tested, timelines compressed for convenience rather than accuracy. But those corrections arrived too late to matter. The image of the sealed house had already taken root, and once it did, it shaped everything that followed. The house became shorthand for deception, a closed system in which Marguerite was presumed to be the controlling variable. Every unanswered question returned to her presence, her survival, her silence. What is often forgotten is how chaotic the crime scene actually was. Police procedures in early 20th century France lacked standardization. Evidence was handled inconsistently. The house was entered by neighbors, officials, and journalists before it was properly secured. Objects were moved, assumptions were made, memory filled in where documentation failed. Yet, in later accounts, that chaos was retroactively smoothed into certainty. A locked door, a staged scene, a single mind behind it all. Marguerite Steinheil's body told a different story, one largely ignored. She bore injuries consistent with restraint, bruises that suggested force, marks that did not align neatly with self-infliction. At the time, these details were acknowledged, but they complicated the preferred narrative. A woman bound and beaten did not fit cleanly into the role already assigned to her, so those details receded. What remained was architecture and implication. Modern criminologists caution against this kind of reasoning. A crime scene should generate hypotheses, not conclusions, when conclusions arrive first. Evidence becomes decorative, selected to support what is already believed. The Steinheil house became an object lesson in that danger. It stood as proof not of guilt, but of how easily space can be transformed into accusation. Walls become witnesses, locks become motives, silence becomes confession. Marguerite herself rarely spoke of the house in later years, not because it held secrets, but because it held no resolution. The house was where her life fractured permanently, where private tragedy became public obsession. To speak of it would be to reopen a wound that had never healed cleanly. And yet, the house never released her, even in England, even decades later. Questions returned to that address. Interviewers framed their inquiries around it. Writers treated it as the origin point of everything that followed, as though her entire identity had been forged inside those walls. Perhaps that is inevitable. Places of violence often outlive the people involved. They become containers for speculation, absorbing meaning long after facts decay. Impasse Ronsin was no exception. But what the house truly represents is not a solution. It is a warning, a reminder of how quickly environments are turned into evidence and how easily ambiguity is mistaken for design. Marguerite Steinheil left the house behind physically, but narratively. She was never allowed to leave, and as long as that house remains central to the story, the question it poses will remain unresolved, not about who committed the crime, but about how badly we want certainty when none is available. The walls at Impasse Ronsin have said nothing for over a century. It is we who keep speaking for them. If the house at Impasse Ronsin became the silent centerpiece of the Steinheil affair, the witnesses became its unreliable chorus from the earliest hours after the murders. Accounts began to diverge. A neighbor claimed to have heard nothing unusual, then later recalled distant sounds. A servant described routines that shifted subtly with each retelling. Officials disagreed on timelines, on the position of bodies, on whether certain doors had been bolted or merely assumed to be. None of these contradictions were extraordinary. They were human, but in a case already saturated with suspicion. Inconsistency was treated not as limitation, but as opportunity. Prosecutors highlighted discrepancies selectively, framing them as evidence of orchestration rather than fallibility. Journalists amplified the most dramatic versions, flattening nuance into headlines. Over time, repetition hardened speculation into common knowledge. Memory, once distorted, became authoritative. Modern psychology offers a clear explanation for this phenomenon. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Each retelling reshapes it. Each external suggestion alters it. Under pressure, witnesses unconsciously align their recollections with what they believe is expected of them. In the Steinheil case, expectation arrived early and loudly, from the moment Marguerite was framed as suspicious. Witnesses began to remember in her direction. Ambiguous details tilted toward implication. Neutral gaps filled themselves with assumption. What could not be remembered clearly was replaced with what made sense narratively. and narrative favored guilt. Marguerite's own testimony suffered from this dynamic. Her statements were parsed aggressively, compared against evolving witness accounts that themselves had shifted over time. When her recollections failed to match altered memories, the discrepancy was attributed to deceit rather than the natural instability of recall. She was expected to be precise in a system that allowed everyone else to be approximate. That imbalance mattered. It created a standard no defendant could reasonably meet, especially one traumatized by violence, confinement, and public scrutiny. Yet the court treated her failure to meet that standard as moral failure, not cognitive reality. The result was a trial that appeared thorough while remaining epistemically fragile. Even acquittal did not correct this imbalance. The public had already absorbed the contradictions as evidence of something hidden. The fact that no version of events could be proven became, paradoxically, proof that Marguerite must be concealing the truth. Uncertainty was no longer neutral. It was incriminating. This is one of the most enduring lessons of the Steinheil affair. When memory is treated as a weapon rather than a limitation, justice becomes performative. It rewards coherence over accuracy, confidence over humility. Marguerite Steinheil was punished not for what could be shown, but for what could not be ruled out. And witnesses, far from clarifying the past, became instruments through which doubt was transformed into suspicion in later years. Historians attempting to reconstruct the case encountered the same problem. Primary sources contradicted one another irreconcilably. Official records disagreed with press accounts. Testimonies preserved in archives no longer aligned with their published summaries. There was no stable foundation to build upon, only layers of interpretation. This instability frustrates modern readers because it denies resolution. We want a missing piece, a final testimony, a forgotten document that will collapse uncertainty into clarity. But the Steinheil case offers no such relief. What it offers instead is a cautionary tale about the limits of knowing. Witnesses do not always clarify truth. Memory does not always converge. And justice does not always emerge stronger from scrutiny. Sometimes, it emerges merely louder. Marguerite Steinheil lived with that noise for decades. She carried the burden of other people's memories, misaligned, amplified, and endlessly repeated. And in that sense, the witnesses never stopped testifying. They simply changed form, from voices in a courtroom to lines in newspapers to footnotes in history, all repeating variations of the same uncertainty, mistaken for meaning, as long as memory is treated as verdict rather than evidence. The Steinheil affair will remain unresolved, not because the truth is hidden, but because it was never stable enough to begin with. In the years following her acquittal, Marguerite Steinheil made a decision that puzzled many and infuriated others. She stopped explaining herself, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, deliberately. She withdrew from the endless cycle of clarification and defense that the public seemed to demand. Interviews became rare, statements shortened, questions met with polite refusal rather than rebuttal. To some observers, this silence confirmed their suspicions. To others, it appeared calculated, but silence, in Marguerite's case, was neither confession nor manipulation. It was exhaustion. For years, she had spoken under pressure, questioned by police, cross-examined in court, dissected by journalists. Every word had been weighed, misquoted, reinterpreted. Explanation had not protected her. If anything, it had multiplied suspicion, so she chose a different posture. Marguerite understood something that many defendants never do, that public narratives are rarely corrected by additional detail. They are only reinforced. Each attempt to clarify invites new angles of doubt. Each denial opens space for alternative interpretations. Silence, by contrast, disrupts momentum. It denies the audience the material it expects. This made her deeply frustrating. Writers complained that she was evasive. Biographers accused her of withholding the truth. Critics framed her restraint as arrogance, as though she owed the public perpetual access to her inner life. But Marguerite owed nothing. She had faced trial. She had been acquitted. The law had spoken. What remained was not obligation, but choice, in modern terms. Her silence can be understood as an assertion of agency. Refusing to perform innocence is not the same as admitting guilt. It is a rejection of the premise that one must endlessly justify one's survival. Yet this refusal clashed violently with cultural expectation. Women implicated in scandal are often required to narrate themselves into acceptability, to confess, repent, explain, reform. Marguerite did none of these things publicly. She did not seek absolution through disclosure. She simply lived, and that, too, became suspect. Silence is rarely neutral. In cases like hers, it becomes a screen onto which others project intention. Her quiet was interpreted as secrecy, her restraint as calculation. The absence of explanation became evidence of something withheld. But there is another way to read her silence, as boundaries. Marguerite Steinheil spent her final decades constructing a life deliberately unremarkable. She avoided public controversy. She did not engage with renewed speculation when her past resurfaced. She declined to revisit it. This was not denial. It was refusal to relive. In doing so, she denied the public a final act, a climactic revelation, a confessional closure. She left the story incomplete by design, and incomplete stories unsettle audiences trained to expect resolution. Her silence forced a confrontation not with her guilt, but with our need for certainty. Why must she explain herself endlessly? Why does survival demand narration? Why does silence provoke more suspicion than contradiction? These questions linger because Marguerite never answered them. She allowed the ambiguity to stand. In a culture that equates transparency with virtue, that choice reads as transgression. But perhaps it was her most human act of all, to step away from the story that had consumed her and refuse to carry it further. Marguerite Steinheil did not disappear. She withdrew, and in that withdrawal, she reclaimed something that had been stripped from her long before the trial began: control over her own voice. History may continue to speak about her, but she chose, finally, not to speak back. Every era believes it will be the one to finally solve the past. Decades after Marguerite Steinheil's death, new generations return to her case with fresh confidence, armed with modern psychology, forensic theory, and social critique. They promised what earlier courts and commentators could not: resolution. They did not find it. Instead, they found something more unsettling: how easily the story reshaped itself to fit the concerns of whoever was telling it. In the 1960s and 70s, Marguerite re-emerged as a symbol of decadence. Her life framed as a cautionary tale about moral collapse at the end of the Belle Époque. Writers emphasized excess, desire, and corruption, using her story to illustrate the fragility of old social orders. In the late 20th century, interpretations shifted again. Feminist scholars revisited the Steinheil affair with sharper questions. They examined how misogyny shaped suspicion, how sexuality was weaponized, how emotional restraint became criminalized. Marguerite was reframed not as a temptress, but as a woman navigating a world eager to punish her autonomy. Even then, consensus remained elusive. Some argued she was unfairly maligned, crushed beneath the weight of male anxiety and institutional bias. Others cautioned against romanticizing her, noting that privilege shielded her in ways unavailable to most women of her time. Both perspectives were partially correct, and both were incomplete. What modern analysis revealed most clearly was not who Marguerite Steinheil was, but how flexible her image had become. She had turned into a cultural container, absorbing whatever meaning the moment required. True crime writers leaned into intrigue. Academics emphasized structure and power. Popular media favored drama and mystery. Each version insisted it was closer to the truth, yet all relied on the same limited archive. No new evidence surfaced. No forgotten confession emerged. No forensic breakthrough closed the case. The past remained stubbornly silent. This persistence of uncertainty challenges a fundamental assumption of historical inquiry, that time clarifies. In some cases, distance sharpens understanding. In others, it erodes it, stripping away context until only outlines remain. Marguerite's case belongs to the latter. As witnesses died and records degraded, interpretation replaced investigation. What could not be known with certainty became increasingly vulnerable to projection. The story hardened not because it was resolved, but because it was repeated, and repetition creates authority. The danger of this process is subtle but profound. When a narrative is retold often enough, it begins to feel inevitable. Alternatives fade. Doubt feels disruptive rather than honest. Marguerite Steinheil's story illustrates this danger perfectly. Despite acquittal, despite evidentiary weakness, despite decades of scholarly caution, she is still introduced as mysterious, dangerous, possibly guilty. The language persists not because it is accurate, but because it is familiar. Familiarity masquerades as truth. What this reveals is less about Marguerite and more about us. We return to unresolved stories not to sit with ambiguity, but to conquer it. We want to close the book, to label, to decide. And when history resists, we grow impatient, so we reshape it. Marguerite Steinheil becomes whatever we need her to be: villain, victim, survivor, symbol. The woman herself recedes further with each interpretation, until she is almost entirely obscured by the weight of meaning placed upon her. And yet, the story endures precisely because it cannot be resolved. It resists the tidy endings we crave. In that resistance lies its power, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder that some truths remain fragmented, incomplete, and uncomfortable. That history is not always a puzzle with missing pieces, but sometimes a mirror reflecting our need for certainty back at us. Marguerite Steinheil does not return to haunt us because of what she did. She returns because we still cannot agree on what she should mean. And until that need fades, her story will never truly rest. There is a particular kind of story that refuses to fade, not because it is unresolved, but because it exposes something unresolved in us. The Steinheil affair is one of those stories. More than a century later, readers and viewers still lean forward at the same moments. The locked house, the surviving woman, the dead president, the acquittal that satisfied the law but unsettled the crowd. These elements trigger a deep psychological response, one rooted less in logic than in instinct. We are uneasy with imbalance. When violence occurs, we expect symmetry, a clear victim, a clear perpetrator, a clear consequence. Marguerite Steinheil disrupted that symmetry. 2 people died violently. She lived. The scales never appeared to level, and so we keep adjusting them in our minds. Modern true crime culture magnifies this impulse. Stories are framed around arcs, setups, twists, reveals, conclusions. Ambiguity is tolerated only temporarily, as a device to heighten suspense before resolution arrives. But Marguerite's story offers no such payoff. There is no final reveal, for many. That feels like failure, so the audience compensates by supplying its own ending. She must have known something. She must have played a role. She must have been more than she claimed. These assumptions restore narrative balance, even if they undermine evidentiary integrity. In this way, suspicion becomes emotional housekeeping. What also persists is discomfort with female survival in the absence of punishment. Marguerite did not die tragically. She did not descend into ruin. She did not confess. She married again. She lived quietly. She aged. This offends an unspoken expectation that scandal must extract a visible price. When it does not, resentment follows. Marguerite's later life, unremarkable as it was, reads to some as evasion. How could someone so closely associated with death go on to live peacefully? The question reveals more about moral appetite than historical fact. We want suffering to validate our outrage, and when it doesn't appear, we reinterpret survival as proof of wrongdoing. This pattern has not disappeared. Modern audiences still struggle with cases where women emerge alive from male violence. Institutional scrutiny, or public disgrace without visibly breaking. Composure is misread as coldness, privacy as concealment, complexity as manipulation. Marguerite Steinheil sits at the root of that pattern. She is not compelling because she was exceptional, but because she was inconvenient. Her existence disrupted the stories people wanted to tell about guilt, gender, and justice. Even sympathetic readings of her life sometimes fall into another trap, turning her into a symbol rather than a person. She becomes a lesson, a warning, a prototype, anything but an individual shaped by contradictory forces. But people are not case studies. They are inconsistent, adaptive, opaque. Marguerite Steinheil was all of those things, and that may be the final reason we cannot let go. Her story denies us the comfort of mastery. We cannot pin it down. We cannot complete it. We cannot file it away as solved, or even as tragic in a satisfying way. It remains open, and open stories make demands of the audience. They ask for humility. They ask for restraint. They ask us to accept that knowing has limits. The Steinheil affair endures because it tests whether we can live with those limits, or whether we will always choose interpretation over uncertainty. Marguerite never offered us closure. The question is whether we are willing to stop demanding it. Every unresolved story extracts a price, not from the dead, they are beyond consequence, but from the living. Who must carry uncertainty forward? In the case of Marguerite Steinheil, that cost was distributed unevenly. Society moved on. Institutions closed their files. Historians shifted focus. Marguerite alone carried the full weight of the unanswered question. For decades, her name functioned as an accusation without charges. Introductions came with qualifiers. Conversations stalled when her past surfaced. Even in England, where distance softened judgment, curiosity lingered just beneath politeness. She was tolerated, not forgotten. This is the quiet aftermath of public suspicion. No verdict can fully erase it. Unlike formal punishment, social judgment has no end date. It does not expire. It does not require proof beyond repetition. Once attached, it follows silently, shaping how others see you and how you are permitted to exist. Marguerite learned to live inside that shadow. She adapted by shrinking her world. Fewer acquaintances, fewer explanations, fewer risks. This withdrawal was often mistaken for secrecy, but it was more accurately a form of self-preservation. She had learned, at great cost, that visibility invited distortion. What remains striking is how little empathy this retreat inspired. Public narratives rarely consider the psychological toll of permanent ambiguity. We imagine survival as victory, acquittal as freedom, time as healing. But unresolved suspicion corrodes differently. It does not erupt, it erodes. Marguerite was never allowed to be finished. Every new retelling reopened the wound. Every casual reference resurrected a past she could not outrun. Even praise came with conditions, admiration tempered by doubt, sympathy laced with suspicion. The unfinished story denied her the dignity of closure. This dynamic reveals something uncomfortable about how societies process unresolved harm. When certainty is unavailable, we often redirect frustration toward the most visible survivor. It is easier to doubt a person than to accept ignorance, easier to assign meaning than to tolerate absence. Marguerite Steinheil became the repository for that discomfort, and in doing so, her individuality was gradually erased. She was no longer Marguerite, the woman who aged, loved, lost, adapted. She became the case, a reference point, a narrative device, her humanity flattened into function. This is the hidden violence of unresolved history. It does not kill, but it reduces. Yet Marguerite resisted that reduction in one crucial way. She lived anyway, quietly, imperfectly, without spectacle. She did not dedicate her life to self-justification or redemption. She did not campaign for historical revision. She accepted that some questions would remain unanswered and refused to let them define every remaining year. This choice did not absolve her in the public mind, but it preserved something more private, a sense of self not entirely consumed by narrative. When she died in 1954, there was no reckoning, no reassessment, no final judgment. The world did not pause to ask whether it had been fair to her. History rarely does. Instead, the story continued, retold by people who never knew her, shaped by needs she never chose, animated by questions she had already stopped answering. The cost of an unfinished story is that it never belongs to the person who lived it. It belongs to those who need it. Marguerite Steinheil paid that cost in full, and perhaps the final. Unresolved question is not whether she was guilty or innocent, but whether any of us, confronted with the same uncertainty, would have been willing to let her simply be, not a mystery, not a symbol, not a warning, just a woman whose life did not provide the ending we wanted, and who refused to manufacture one for us. If Marguerite Steinheil's trial ended in acquittal, her judgment did not. It merely changed venue, outside the courtroom, beyond the reach of statutes and procedure. Another court convened, one without rules, without standards of proof, and without the possibility of appeal. It was held in cafes, newspapers, drawing rooms, and later in books and documentaries. Its verdict was never formally announced. Yet it shaped her fate more enduringly than any legal decision. This was the court of public meaning. Here, Marguerite was not evaluated on evidence, but on coherence. Her life was examined not for facts, but for symbolism. Every event was retroactively aligned to support a single question. What kind of woman was she? And once that question took precedence, the crimes themselves became secondary. The deaths of Adolphe Steinheil and Émilie Japy receded into the background, replaced by fascination with Marguerite's personality, her lovers, her manner, her refusal to perform grief as expected. Violence became context, character became cause. This inversion is critical. When societies lose faith in certainty, they often turn inward, toward moral interpretation. Instead of asking what happened, they ask who deserves blame, and deserving is far easier to determine than truth. Marguerite's acquittal disrupted this instinct. It denied the public the satisfaction of closure, while refusing to offer a replacement explanation that felt emotionally complete. In response, judgment detached itself from law and settled into narrative. She was judged for surviving, judged for being articulate, judged for not collapsing under scrutiny. Each of these traits, neutral or admirable in other contexts, became suspect in hers. The irony is that Marguerite's restraint, so often cited as evidence of manipulation, was also her only viable defense. Any visible emotional excess would have been weaponized, any inconsistency framed as deception. She was required to be perfect in a system that allowed no margin for human error. That impossibility guaranteed suspicion. In this sense, Marguerite Steinheil was not judged for what she did, but for what she failed to be: a morally legible woman, someone whose emotions aligned neatly with public expectation, someone whose life could be explained without discomfort. She was none of those things, and so the public supplied what she would not. Judgment without verdict is uniquely corrosive. It offers no resolution, no punishment, no redemption, only permanence. It follows quietly, embedding itself into reputation, distorting every future interpretation. Marguerite understood this early. Her decision to leave France was not an admission of guilt, but an acknowledgement of this secondary court's power. She could escape prison. She could not escape meaning, even in England, where her story carried less immediate weight. She remained marked. Introductions came with hesitation. Curiosity lingered. Silence was read as calculation rather than fatigue. She was free, but never unexamined. This is the enduring lesson of her story. Legal innocence does not guarantee social absolution. In fact, acquittal can intensify suspicion when it conflicts with public desire for certainty. When the law fails to deliver emotional resolution, society creates its own. Marguerite Steinheil lived in that gap, between what could be proven and what was believed, between verdict and judgment. Her life after the trial was not defined by punishment, but by interpretation. And interpretation, unlike law, does not require evidence. It requires only repetition. That repetition continues. Each retelling reopens the case. Each framing implies a conclusion. Each question asked of her story assumes an answer waiting to be found. But perhaps the most honest response to Marguerite Steinheil is not to decide what she was, but to recognize what was done to her. She was judged without a verdict, and that judgment, unbounded by restraint, proved far more enduring than any sentence a court could have imposed. As long as we return to her story seeking certainty rather than understanding, that judgment remains in force, not against her, but against our willingness to accept that some lives do not resolve into answers. At the heart of the Steinheil affair lies a craving that extends far beyond one woman or one crime. The desire for a culprit. When violence erupts without explanation, it fractures our sense of order. Randomness feels intolerable. The idea that terrible things can happen without design, without motive, without warning, threatens the belief that the world is ultimately legible. So, we search for intention in Marguerite Steinheil. Society found a figure capable of absorbing that need. She was visible, unconventional, and already associated with scandal. She fit the emotional outline of culpability. Even when she did not fit the legal one, this distinction mattered less than it should have. The deaths of Adolphe Steinheil and Émilie Japy demanded meaning. They were intimate, violent, and deeply unsettling. To accept that their killer, or killers, were never identified would be to accept a form of chaos. Marguerite offered an alternative, not evidence, but focus. Her presence allowed the public to compress uncertainty into a single human form. It allowed fear to become accusation. It allowed outrage to feel purposeful. And once that process began, it became self-reinforcing. Every inconsistency in her testimony became suspicious. Every refusal to speculate was framed as concealment. Every attempt to move on was interpreted as escape. The absence of proof was not a barrier. It was an invitation to imagine. The desire for a culprit does not require guilt. It requires plausibility. Marguerite's life, shaped by independence and proximity to power, supplied that plausibility in abundance. Her story felt narratively complete with her at its center. Even if the facts resisted that arrangement, this phenomenon is not unique. History is full of cases where social anxiety condenses around a single figure, transforming them into a symbolic offender. Often, these figures are women, outsiders, or those who defy normative roles. Their complexity makes them adaptable containers for fear. Marguerite Steinheil was such a container. She allowed the public to believe that tragedy had an author, even if that author could not be proven. And belief, once established, proved more durable than fact. The legal system resisted this impulse. The court demanded evidence. It required proof beyond suspicion. In acquitting Marguerite, it upheld a principle that uncertainty must not be punished. But the public rejected that restraint. For many, the absence of a culprit felt like an injustice greater than the risk of condemning the wrong person. Certainty, even if imagined, was preferable to ambiguity. This preference reveals a profound tension. Justice requires humility. Narrative demands resolution. When these two values collide, narrative often wins. Marguerite lived at the site of that collision. Her continued existence after the trial served as a constant reminder that the story had not ended as expected. Each year she lived without confession or collapse renewed the discomfort. The desire for a culprit did not fade. It sharpened, and so judgment persisted. It attached not to her actions, but to her refusal to disappear, to her quiet aging, to her normalcy. These were not exonerating. They were provocative. Why was she allowed peace? The question exposes the cruelty of unresolved blame. It demands punishment where none can be justified. It confuses moral satisfaction with justice. Marguerite Steinheil's story endures because it confronts us with that confusion. It asks whether our need to assign guilt outweighs our commitment to evidence, whether we value coherence more than fairness, whether we can tolerate stories that end without villains. In refusing to provide a culprit, history left a void. Marguerite was asked to fill it, and in that demand, we see not her guilt, but our own discomfort with uncertainty laid bare. The Steinheil affair does not accuse Marguerite Steinheil. It accuses us of preferring answers to honesty, of choosing narrative over restraint, of mistaking plausibility for proof. Until we reckon with that impulse, the desire for a culprit will continue to haunt not just her story, but every unresolved one that follows. There is a moment in every unresolved case when suspicion stops being a response to events and becomes a permanent identity. For Marguerite Steinheil, that moment arrived quietly, after the trial, after the verdict, after the public outrage should have faded. It arrived when her name ceased to describe a person and began to function as a shorthand. To say Marguerite Steinheil was no longer to reference a woman. It was to invoke implication. This is how suspicion completes its work. At first, it clings to behavior, then to circumstance. Finally, it detaches from both and settles into reputation, where it can persist without justification. Once there, it no longer needs evidence. It survives on association alone. Marguerite's identity was rewritten not by what she did, but by what others could not explain. She became the woman who survived. The woman who was there. The woman at the center of it all. Each phrase carried weight without meaning. Each suggested causation without stating it outright. This vagueness was its strength. It allowed suspicion to remain flexible, adapting to any retelling without ever being disproven. In this way, Marguerite's life was absorbed into her case. Everything she did afterward was interpreted through that lens. Her move to England became escape. Her second marriage became strategy. Her silence became concealment. Even her longevity became suspicious, as though survival itself were a kind of triumph over justice. This is the final stage of public judgment, when suspicion becomes identity. Innocence becomes irrelevant. No action can undo it. No evidence can dislodge it. No verdict can reverse it. The person no longer exists separately from the narrative imposed upon them. Marguerite understood this, even if she never articulated it publicly. Her withdrawal from public life was not resignation, it was recognition. Recognition that arguing with an identity assigned by others only reinforces it, so she refused to participate. She did not attempt reinvention. She did not seek vindication. She did not ask history to reconsider her kindly. She lived with the understanding that some labels, once applied, cannot be removed, only ignored. But ignoring them came at a cost. Suspicion as identity is isolating. It reshapes relationships, narrows trust, and limits intimacy. People do not ask questions directly. They infer, they wonder, they hesitate, and that hesitation becomes the boundary around one's life. Marguerite's later years were quiet, not because she desired obscurity, but because obscurity was safer than interpretation. What makes her story so enduring is not the violence that began it, but the transformation that followed. She became an example of how societies metabolize uncertainty, by assigning it to a person and calling the result character. This process continues today. We see it whenever unresolved harm attaches itself to an individual rather than to chance. Complexity, or systemic failure. When suspicion hardens into identity, it ceases to be about justice and becomes about containment. Marguerite Steinheil was contained not by prison walls, but by narrative, and that containment proved far more durable. Her story warns us that the most lasting judgments are not delivered by courts, but by repetition, not by evidence, but by implication, not by law, but by comfort. The comfort of believing we know who someone is, even when we do not know what they did. Marguerite Steinheil did not die accused in a legal sense. She died defined by a suspicion no one could prove, but no one was willing to release. And perhaps the final injustice of her story is not that we failed to determine her guilt or innocence, but that we allowed uncertainty to become her name, until we learn to separate unresolved events from permanent identity. Her story will continue to repeat, not only in history books, but in the lives of others who survive what cannot be explained and are asked, endlessly, to account for it. Marguerite Steinheil was one of the first to bear that burden. She was not the last. At some point, every unresolved story reaches a threshold where the question is no longer what happened, but what are we willing to accept? The Steinheil affair crossed that threshold long ago. More than a century of retellings has not brought clarity, only refinement. The arguments are sharper, the language more careful, the frameworks more sophisticated. Yet the core remains unchanged. A violent crime without a proven perpetrator, and a woman who lived beyond it. What changes over time is not the evidence, but our tolerance for ambiguity. Modern audiences often believe themselves better equipped to handle uncertainty. We speak openly about bias, about flawed systems, about the limits of memory and narrative. And yet, when confronted with a story like Marguerite Steinheil's, the old instincts resurface. We still ask, what really happened that night? We still search for hidden intent. We still suspect the survivor. The persistence of these instincts suggests something sobering. Ambiguity is not a temporary discomfort. It is a permanent condition we resist learning to live with. Marguerite Steinheil's story endures because it refuses to conform to our preferred moral geometry. There is no clean alignment of guilt and consequence, no transformation arc, no redemptive suffering. The balance never resolves, and so we keep returning, not to solve the case, but to test ourselves against it. How much uncertainty can we tolerate before we impose meaning? How much restraint can we maintain before suspicion fills the void? How long can we hold space for not knowing without demanding a face to attach it to? These are not historical questions, they are contemporary ones. The Steinheil affair becomes, in this light, less about Marguerite herself and more about the structures that surround her, structures that still exist, media ecosystems that reward coherence over caution, social judgments that outpace evidence, cultural scripts that demand emotional legibility, especially from women. Marguerite failed those scripts not by defiance, but by being irreducible. She could not be simplified without distortion. She could not be condemned without proof. She could not be redeemed without confession. So she remained suspended, an unresolved figure in a world uncomfortable with suspension. What, then, is the final measure of truth in such a case? It is not certainty. It is restraint. The restraint to stop short of conclusion when evidence ends. The restraint to separate discomfort from guilt. The restraint to allow a life to remain incomplete in our understanding by that measure. The Steinheil affair challenges not the woman at its center, but the audience around it, past and present alike. Did we respect the limits of what could be known? Or did we cross them in search of comfort? Marguerite Steinheil lived inside that question for decades. She carried it quietly, without resolution, without vindication, without surrender. Her endurance was not heroic. It was human, and perhaps that is the final truth her story offers. That justice is not only about answers, but about boundaries, about knowing when to stop speaking, about resisting the urge to finish stories that do not belong to us. Marguerite Steinheil's life does not ask us to decide her guilt or innocence. It asks something more difficult. Whether we can accept that some truths remain unfinished and still choose fairness over certainty. The story does not end here, but it does ask us to pause, and in that pause, to consider whether the final measure of truth is not what we conclude, but what we refuse to assume. There is a difference between ending a story and abandoning it. Ending requires resolution. Abandoning requires restraint. The Steinheil affair demands the second. To let the story end is not to decide what happened inside the house at Impasse Ronsin. It is not to declare Marguerite Steinheil innocent or guilty at last. It is to acknowledge, honestly, that the record does not permit certainty, and that forcing certainty where it does not exist is an act of violence in itself. This is where many retellings fail. They promise revelation. They suggest hidden truths. They frame ambiguity as a puzzle waiting for the right mind to solve it, but the archive does not cooperate. What remains are fragments, testimonies shaped by fear and expectation, evidence compromised by time and procedure, interpretations layered atop one another until the original facts are barely visible. To insist that clarity must still be achievable is to misunderstand the nature of historical loss. Some knowledge is gone, and pretending otherwise does not restore it. It only replaces it with invention. Marguerite Steinheil lived long enough to see this process begin. She watched as her life was reduced to a case study. Her name detached from her personhood and repurposed as a question mark. She understood that the story would outlive her, and that she would have little control over how it was told, so she chose not to compete with it. This choice is often misread as evasion, but it can also be read as a refusal to participate in a system that demanded endless self-explanation without offering absolution. Marguerite recognized that some audiences do not seek truth, they seek confirmation. Silence. Then was not defeat. It was an exit. To let the story end is to respect that exit, to stop dragging her back into speculation as though her life were an unfinished experiment, to recognize that her refusal to resolve the narrative was not a failure, but a boundary. This does not mean forgetting the victims. Adolphe Steinheil and Émilie Japy deserve remembrance unburdened by projection. Their deaths were real, violent, and unresolved, but honoring them does not require assigning blame where evidence fails. Mourning does not demand a culprit. It demands care. The Steinheil affair asks us to practice a form of historical ethics that is rarely comfortable, to distinguish between inquiry and consumption, between understanding and entertainment, between responsibility and curiosity. When we retell this story, what are we doing? Are we clarifying, or are we dramatizing? Are we examining systems, or reinforcing suspicion? Are we honoring complexity, or flattening it into trope? These questions matter because stories shape memory, and memory shapes judgment. Each time Marguerite Steinheil's name is invoked as shorthand for danger or deceit, the old pattern repeats. Uncertainty converted into identity. Letting the story end means interrupting that pattern. It means telling the story without finishing it artificially. It means allowing the final chapter to remain open, not because it is incomplete, but because completeness would require invention. History is not obligated to satisfy us. Marguerite Steinheil's life, when stripped of myth, offers no revelation, only endurance. She survived scandal, trial, exile, and time itself. She lived quietly after public noise and died without resolution. That may be the most honest ending available. Not a verdict, not a confession, not a twist, but a recognition that some lives intersect with violence without yielding explanation, that some stories expose the limits of justice rather than its triumphs, that sometimes the most responsible act is not to conclude, but to stop. Marguerite Steinheil does not need to be solved. She needs to be left alone. And perhaps the final task of anyone who encounters her story now is not to ask what she did, but to decide whether we are willing, at last, to let the story rest where the evidence ends. That is not closure. It is respect. When the questions finally stop, something unexpected remains. Not answers, not certainty, but clarity of a different kind. What remains of Marguerite Steinheil? Once we set aside suspicion and abandon the demand for resolution, is not a mystery, but a lesson about power, narrative, and restraint. Her life shows us how easily a person can be overtaken by a story they did not choose, how quickly proximity becomes implication, how survival itself can be transformed into accusation when it refuses to follow a script of punishment or repentance. Marguerite Steinheil did not control the events that defined her public identity, but she did control how much of herself she surrendered to interpretation. In the end, she gave very little. That refusal is often framed as coldness. It may be something else entirely. It may be dignity. History is filled with figures who are remembered because they resolved something, founded a movement, confessed a crime, embodied a cause. Marguerite is remembered because she did not. She left a space where certainty was expected and forced everyone around her to confront their discomfort with that space. In doing so, she revealed the machinery behind judgment. She showed how media constructs meaning faster than courts, how morality often replaces evidence, how women are asked to make themselves legible at a cost men are rarely required to pay. Her story persists not because of what she did, but because of what we do with stories like hers. Every retelling, becomes a test. Do we sharpen suspicion or soften it? Do we respect limits or push past them? Do we treat ambiguity as failure or as truth? The Steinheil affair does not reward certainty. It punishes it. Each confident conclusion collapses under scrutiny, leaving behind the same fragile archive, the same unanswered questions, and perhaps that is its final contribution. It teaches us that not every story is a puzzle. Some are boundaries. They mark the edge of what can be known and challenge us to stop there without turning back to impose meaning. Marguerite Steinheil lived a long life after the noise faded. She aged, she lost, she adapted, she died quietly. Whatever she carried from those years inside the house at Impasse Roncine, she carried alone. We are not entitled to it. What we are entitled to is reflection. Reflection on how quickly we equate suspicion with insight. On how readily we mistake narrative satisfaction for justice. On how often we ask survivors to explain what cannot be explained, when we stop asking what Marguerite Steinheil did. A harder question emerges. Why did we need her to mean something so badly? That question does not belong to the past. It belongs to us. And until we answer it honestly, new Marguerites will appear. New survivors caught in unresolved harm. New lives reduced to symbols. New stories we refuse to let end. Marguerite Steinheil's story closes not with a revelation, but with a choice. We can continue to circle her life, searching for certainty that does not exist. Or we can acknowledge the limits of knowledge and step back. To do the latter is not to abandon truth, it is to practice it, because sometimes the most truthful thing we can say about a life is not, "This is what happened," but this is where the evidence stops. And in that space, silence is not evasion, it is honesty.